Yeah, I mean, we've kind of touched a lot on Derek, his personality, the work he's done, how he kind of published Reasons and Persons, his philosophical influences. We're going to get now into a bit of his actual kind of philosophical writing within Reasons and Persons. Obviously, this then obviously extends after Reasons and Persons and his other work. So we'll obviously be kind of brushing up against the person Parfit consistently as we do this. Um, it's mainly going to be on sections probably 2, 3, and 4 of Reasons and Persons for those who are listening that might have read it, if there is anybody out there. But I found these to be extremely interesting, so I'm quite excited to dive into this. The first one really is around this idea of harmless torturers. So Parfit explores the idea of kind of small individual actions and how they can have an accumulative effect. So would you mind exploring the harmless torturers and that thought experiment for us?
Yeah. Um, so he has a whole section on what he calls mistakes in moral mathematics, and again, it's incredibly rich and just sort of brilliant to read. And he's very creative in his thought experiments. Although, actually, interestingly, the harmless torturers is really mildly, I would say, plagiarized from another example, which we can also talk about. So one thing he wonders is whether if you do something which is so negligible that it's almost indiscernible, whether you've done something wrong. So one example might be, you know, climate change, obviously catastrophic what's happening to the world, but I don't know, maybe we're contributing a bit, I don't know, to climate change. At the moment, there's some electricity that we're using up that we're not helping, probably, by having, who knows, by having this conversation. We'd probably be better turning all the lights off and lying in the dark. So that's a small contribution to climate change, but it's negligible, right? I mean, given all the other things that's going on, what we're doing makes zero difference. Or, the Oxford example, of course, is walking across the Fellows' garden. They have these beautiful landscape gardens. There's always a sign saying, "Do not walk across the grass." If one person walks across the grass, it would make no difference. You wouldn't even notice. You would only notice if you walked across the grass. I walked that way, then I walked back, then I walked back again, and I walked 1,000 times across the grass, and then there will be you'd notice it. The garden might be not so aesthetically pleasing. We would have to do a lot of interviews to have an effect on climate change, but you could imagine, adding up all the effects that one does throughout one's life, and it will still be negligible, but it won't be kind of completely zero. And so the question is, well, if what I'm doing this particular time makes no difference, really, it's not discernible, how can we say it's wrong? So one thing you could say about that is that if you add up all the effects of what you do as an individual and realize that this is part of all the effects, then you can see that it's part of something which is wrong. And that's why it's wrong. So to go back to my example about the garden, maybe walking across the garden once, nobody will notice. But if I walk back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for 24 hours, then you would notice, and I would have had an effect, a bad effect, terrible effect on the garden, and I'd have ruined everybody's aesthetic experience. But then Parfit comes up with this other example, which, so finally, to get to your harmless torturers, sorry, the preamble was necessary to explain what's coming up now. So imagine I'm going to torture you. And you're sitting in a contraption. You're on your seat, and I've wired you up. And if I turn a little dial, I will increase the pressure, the pain on you. But let's say I do it to a tiny, tiny, tiny extent, so you don't notice. So to go back to our earlier example, one thing to say about that is I've done nothing wrong. You haven't even noticed. And one answer to that is, well, if I did it time after time after time, you would notice. So if I did it 100 times, then you would notice. And so my little action would be part of a set of actions that would be bad. Then Parfit imagines the following case, which is an extra complication. Imagine that there are 1,000 people like me, torturers. And at the other end, there were 1,000 people like you, sitting on your seats, wired up. This time, I don't increase the dial on you 1,000 times. What I do is go from left to right, increasing the dial on each person attached to the seat a tiny, tiny bit. And I do that to 1,000 people, none of whom can notice any difference because I've done it just to a time. Now, imagine there were 1,000 people like that. They all do exactly the same thing. What is the effect on you? The effect on you is just as bad as if I have done it to you 1,000 times. Okay? It makes no sense to say, because I haven't hurt anybody to a discernible extent, I have done nothing wrong. What I've done is clearly as bad as if I'd done it to you 1,000 times. Because, and this is Parfit's point, we have to see our actions not just as part of a set of actions that I myself have done, but as part of a set of actions that other people have done as well. So I mentioned that he's absolutely brilliant with all his thought experiments. Actually, I think he basically steals that one. Oh, I didn't steal anything, but basically the origin of that one comes from another great philosopher who's still with us called Jonathan Glover. And Jonathan Glover imagines that there are 1,000 bandits, and they go into a village, and each villager has 100 baked beans. Actually, let's make it, each villager has 1,000 baked beans. And each bandit steals all the baked beans from one villager. So they've deprived each bandit deprives one villager of all their baked beans. So they've got no baked beans left. And then Glover imagines that each of the bandits, instead of doing that, takes just one bean from each villager. So cumulatively, the effect is the same. No villager is left with any baked beans. And that's rather like Parfit's kind of harmless torturer. It must be the case that what's happened is just as bad as if each bandit stole all the stuff from just one person. Each bandit ends up with 1,000 baked beans. Each villager ends up with no baked beans. Either way. So how can you say it's okay to do it one way, but not to do it the other way? That's the point.
Yeah, again, it's such an interesting thought experiment. I mean, I found it to be extremely challenging, quite a lot of this to be scary and challenging, like things that I've never thought about before. And also probably a disclaimer that's worth saying now for the listener/viewer. We're not going to be diving deeply into all of these. We're going to be skimming them. And the hope is that you'll go away and obviously read David's book and then hopefully also read Parfit's book if you find it, to be a pursuit worthwhile, which I hope you do. If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.